This week's Bible reading plan is on Hagar and Ishmael in the life of Abraham. There are quite a number of things that we can reflect on, but I like to focus on Abraham's journey of faith with God. Last week, we read about God's promise to Abraham to provide him an heir, his very own flesh and blood. His offspring would be as numerous as the stars. This promise actually goes back to when Abraham was around 75 years old, when God called him out of Haran. So this was the second time God was making the promise to Abraham, and he even made the covenant through a sacrifice. That means he was really serious about it. We pick up the story in Genesis 16. It's probably been around 10 years since the first promise of an offspring. Abraham and Sarah are still childless, so they both think it's a good idea to help God along with his plan. They end up having a baby, Ishmael, through their servant Hagar. Perhaps, with great relief, Abraham and Sarah thought they could move on with life, knowing that the promise of God had been fulfilled. So it must have come as a shock when God met up with Abraham, who was now turning 100 years old. Ishmael was already a 14-year-old teenager by then. God tells Abraham more specifically this time that Sarah will be the one to give him a son. She would be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. Abraham's response? How about Ishmael? If only Ishmael might live under your blessing. Does that sometimes sound familiar in our lives? If only God would do it my way. As time passes and God's promises seem to fade away and seem to be more impossible, we act according to the flesh. We take things into our own hands. Paul wrote in Galatians chapter 4, "For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by the slave woman and the other by the free woman. His son by the slave woman was born according to the flesh, but his son by the free woman was born as the result of a divine promise." The encouragement here is to trust God to fulfill His divine promises. Let's not be tempted to rely on our own strength and abilities alone to make the promises happen. Don't take shortcuts or make compromises. They lead to heartaches and consequences. But God in His grace can still use the situation if we get back on track with Him. As we wait, faithfully carry out what God has instructed. Trust God to do it through us in His timing. When it happens, the glory is His alone. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust.